All right, today we came back to Georgetown, South Carolina. We're going to take a trolley tour that we didn't get a chance to take on Sunday when we were here. It's Wednesday right now. Most things were closed on Sunday here. So we're going to take a quick trolley tour of the city and see some sights that we probably haven't seen. Come along on a guest adventure, where everyone's a guest, including me.
Those 15-inch wide boards, they belong directly to the King of England himself. It should not still be here. But then the next thing they saw was great growing land. They saw great growing land for two crops. The first crop that was introduced to this area by Eliza Lucas Pinckney. She was living at Hampton Plantation, and at that time she was 14 years old when she was studying this one plant called indigo. Indigo was a plant used to make a deep blue or a deep purple dye. The wealthier people, the nobility, they loved this color that the plant would produce. But the main crop for Georgetown, 100%, was rice. We were the best growing land for rice in the world. We had roughly 200 some odd plantations producing, and about 70% of the rice consumed in this new country was coming out of this county. So this became an extremely wealthy area. Now, the way that you grow rice, my dad used to do this. You have to build an embankment all the way around a field beside the river. And that embankment's called the dike. And through that, you would put a wooden contraption called a trunk. A trunk is kind of like a wooden pipe with gates on each end. And one end would be in the river, the other end would be in the rice field. And so they could raise those gates or lower them to either drain the field or to flood the field. Of course, with the end of slavery, that ended the rice culture at Georgetown. Some tried to bring it back, particularly Elizabeth Alston Pringle. She was the daughter of the governor of South Carolina at the time. And wooden boats line the street all the way down. Now, this festival will attract roughly around 30-some-odd thousand people each year. So if you were in the area in October, I suggest coming down for that day. And they lived in Hopsawee Plantation just south of us. You can tour Hopsawee also, and they have a restaurant on site and everything too. But the house was built by Mary Mann, a young lady who had inherited a lot of property at a very early age. And the thought has always been is that she went to Charleston. She saw the Miles Bruton house on King Street, the most fashionable home at its time in Charleston, came to Georgetown and built herself a wooden copy of that house. Now she'd had all the lumber milled at her plantation, Mansfield Plantation. Mansfield Plantation is a beautiful bed and breakfast. You can stay there now on site. And this is where they filmed parts of the movie The Patriot with Mel Gibson years ago. So she built this house with formal rooms on the first floor, and on the second floor right side was a ballroom. So she built it to entertain in. She built it to show her wealth, because young ladies were not supposed to hold property ownership. And I hate to say it, but she built it to catch a wealthy husband. So she lived here with, and she used this house often. She left it to her daughter. Her daughter's name was Esther Jane. She lived in Charleston and preferred to be there, so she very rarely came here. And then Esther Jane left it to her daughter. In 1876, it sold to the Hazard Doyle family from Newport, Rhode Island. In Newport, they were in shipping and lumber. They came to Georgetown from lumber and banking after the Civil War. And their most famous relative was Commodore Matthew Perry, who opened trade to Japan. So when she arrived here thinking she had all this land with her new husband John, there was no land. Basically, it was all gone. She went into a lawsuit against the king, and she actually won. This is still referenced in British law today in regards to property ownership and title. But Mary and John, they ended up being able to get a few lots back, and so this lot here, it was returned to them. So where the original house was where this meter box is. That's where the original house ended. The horizontal window was where the original front porch was, and of course it faced down towards the Salmon River. So we have a lot of these structures because black cypress and heart pine, those two types of wood, they were plentiful here. But also, they were two types of wood that insects that destroy wood do not like. So down here on our waterfront, this large wooden building, this is one of the oldest remaining wood fish houses still standing on the East Coast. When I was a kid, it's black cypress. When I was a kid, it was the fish house of Mr. Rainey. And Mr. Cthulhu, he made Georgetown famous at the time for bringing in sturgeon. And the caviar from that was a delicacy. The most famous event he ever sent that to was for the inauguration of President John F. Kennedy. Now, we had a lot of presidents and dignitaries here throughout time, from George Washington on up. Particularly in the 1930s, we had a lot of recognizable names that you will come to visit here. They came to visit with a man named Bernard Baruch. Baruch was the great financier who helped bring the U.S. out of the Great Depression, but he was entertaining people at his home here in Georgetown, such as Franklin Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, Winston Churchill. Mr. Baruch's home is now a museum site. It's in a trust, but it's 16,000 acres called Hobcaw Barony. He built a 15,000 square foot mansion house on the site. So down to my right, across the river, across the intercoastal, all of that land across the river is Hobcaw Barony. You have to make reservations to tour it, but it's a wonderful tour. Now, Mr. Baruch, we went over there last year for a black tie event. And on that evening, we had a special speaker. It was about a 200-person seated dinner. And this speaker, he was talking about his family being the first owners of Hobcaw Barony. And that speaker was Lord Charles Spencer, Princess Diana's brother. So the Spencers were the first owner. Now, Mr. Baruch had a famous daughter. Her name was Belle. Belle was a socialite. She was traveling the world in the 20s and 30s. Very wealthy woman, and she ended up staying here mostly in Georgetown because she loved Hobcaw Barony so much. But Belle was the first woman in this area to pilot a plane. So as I pull up here, we are going to discuss the two here on my left. These two homes were built by one father for each daughter to have as a wedding gift. The cream-colored house has never left the family. It's still the same family from when it was built, finishing up around 1790. Now, the White House here, you'll notice the blue plaque as we go around on some of our structures. If it's a blue plaque, it is pre-Civil War. It has got a ship on there from the time of being a seaport. It is 1790, roughly circa date. It's haint blue. It is still a men's organization. They still meet annually, and they're one of the oldest meeting groups in the U.S. This building was not only built to be a society hall, it also was a library, and it also was a school for any child to attend. Dr. Withers, his first home in Georgetown was this greenhouse. This is 1750. These older homes like this, we have about 10 of them still standing that were designed by the Cutno brothers, who were master craftsmen during their time. So this marker to my left is actually marking this large live oak tree back here in the back, this evergreen. This tree is one of the tallest in South Carolina. The angel oak down near Charleston is the widest. This tree in 1950 was thought to be 500 years old, but it's actually pushing 700 years old now. The very next one was the offspring of the larger tree, and it's now a state champion also. On our rice plantations, they were planting these trees in the alleys and patterns and rows. One of our plantations, called Springfield, has over 300 of them planted in beautiful patterns and rows. I always think it's every time I go there, I think, gosh, the people that planted this never got to see what we see today. The Congdon home is over to my left. This house was built to impress. You'll notice by the front door there's a 1903 plaque. Now when a structure becomes 100, it gets a white plaque put on it. So these front doors are original leaded glass, and the windows to the left and on the balcony go all the way up so that you'd be able to walk from the inside to the out. Mr. Congdon had about 5 daughters, so I imagine he expected a lot of weddings and other events in this house. This home during my time was the home of Dr. Frances Doyle, and she was the first woman in the state to become a doctor. She was a pediatrician. She lived on the second floor on the right side of the house only with her mother, and when the house came on the market, it was, when they opened up the rooms, it was just like a time capsule from 1903. So the next structure here to my right is the Samson Sawyer. Samson for the first owner, Sawyer for the current. This one tells a lot about colonial Georgetown. You had to build something with a chimney when you got a piece of property from the king, or else you had 6 months to a year to build, or else he could take the property back and resell it. So there in the back, that little structure, it looks like a one-story addition. Well, that's a separate kitchen house. The kitchen house being separate in case of fire. So if you had to build something with a chimney, the first thing you would build was a place to cook and to heat. A house like this was all slave labor and took roughly 10 years to build because they had to build in the off-season, and they also had to get most of the material needed shipped over from England. So this house also has another thing that happened to it. It had, this was a time period when you were being taxed on your frontage, your doors, and your windows, whatever faced the street. So they figured out quickly, turned the houses sideways, shorter side to the street, less taxes. Now back in the back, that kitchen house, there's an old South Carolina story with that back in the day when you'd have a lot of animals in the yard, particularly a lot of puppies, you would ask the cook to go into the cookhouse and fry up some round balls of dough to feed the puppies, to make them be quiet. And what would she say when she fed the puppies? Hush puppies, that's right. The round balls of dough. So you think about that when having the seafood platter, the South Carolina hush puppy story. 1750, 24 on the walking tour map. The brass plaque is the National Registry. These homes would not have been white. They would have been color. Color was a sign of wealth. Also, these windows are a later addition because these larger panes of glass also became a sign of wealth. Down in Charleston, there was always a famous saying after the Civil War, when Charleston was in such ruin and so poor, they had a saying that they're too poor to paint, but too proud to whitewash. This 620 Prince is to my right. This is one of our bed and breakfasts downtown. They've been featured by Southern Living Magazine and other publications this year. So if you're coming to stay in town, we have lots of VRBO and Airbnbs. You can get an entire house or a bed and breakfast, or soon the New George Hotel. Here to my right, 1735. This is the old Colonial Banking building. All of the commerce happened kind of in this section of Prince Street. This originally was called Princess Street. But all of the material to build the structure had to come directly from England. It is English brick with a mixture called tabby over it. Tabby is shell, limestone, and sand made into a mortar, spread over the brick, and then they drew these lines through it to make it look like large blocks of stone. Because this was the bank, they wanted it to look like a fortress. Now this is also where George Washington was, he spoke in 1791 to the Wynyard Lodge of the Freemasons. You know, I learned recently, we have a lot of pre-Revolutionary War homes also in town, and a high inventory of 18th century, because during times of war, it was considered bad form to destroy a Freemason's property. Coming up next, over here to my left, this is our Robert Mills designed courthouse. Robert Mills was an architect designing all around South Carolina. This was built to be a fireproof building. Originally, there was a wooden structure here that went down in a hurricane. Then one was burned in a fire, and so they built this building to be a fireproof building. Robert Mills not only designed these courthouses and homes, but he also designed the Washington Monument in D.C. I just saw in Newberry, South Carolina, there's a Robert Mills house just came on the market. It's a wonderful large brick home. So this is Screven Street, named for Elisha Screven, who laid out the city. And I'm going to point out to my left our South Carolina state flag. Indigo blue for the indigo plant. The palmetto tree is on it because palmetto logs were used to build the old forts that protected the cities, and British cannonballs couldn't penetrate them. They just sort of sank into the walls of the fort. And then it also has the crescent moon on there. Well, that crescent moon is also said to be the medallion that soldiers in Charleston wore around the chest while fighting against the British. But it did something bad. It reflected. So that's where the old term shoot for the moon came from. To my right is a similar flag in red. That is the flag of the Citadel, the military college down in Charleston. And the Citadel Cadets, of course, were the first to open fire starting the Civil War. Our state flower is the yellow jessamine. Our state bird is the Carolina wren. But if we get some rain during these rainy times of the year, our state bird can change for a while. We all say it changes to the mosquito. This temple, they officially congregated in 1904, but the faith had been here for many, many years practicing in their own homes. I always bring up my dear friend Retta. She passed away at 100 years old. She was my neighbor. She attended church here. She said for 65 years she played the organ.
Wow.
And she took great pride in her temple. She's one of those colorful characters. She taught classical voice and piano every day. And y'all, up until the time she passed away at 100 years old, I never saw anything on her feet but white high heels.
Oh, wow.
That's all she would wear. She was known as the Adorable Rit. So here to my right, 1790, this home rests on a foundation of English brick, and then around that archway is Bermuda limestone. That limestone and brick were used as ballast to hold a ship down in the waters and cross the Atlantic, or else it would just bob around in the water. Then they would unload the material here to build with once they arrived, and they would reload with rice and tobacco and all the goods going back. Now, a typical rice barrel weighed roughly 600 pounds. So this staircase is another South Carolina story. That one side is for a lady to enter the house, and one side is for a gentleman to enter the house. Because a true gentleman never wanted to risk accidentally seeing a lady's ankles when she picked up her skirts. Here to my right, this side over here, or left, excuse me, left, I'm backwards this morning. This has always been kind of interesting to me because right in the middle of the city, this site was originally the jail. And this building was the jail up until the 1960s. The building itself was built in 1845. It originally had a third story on it, and that's where the jail cells were. The middle story was where the warden lived. And then on the bottom, of course, here was the jail yard itself, and the wall was much higher. So in the 1960s, when it was no longer used as a jail, it then became the library, and now it's part of Prince George Parish Church, the Anglican Church here in town. This entire block to my left is part of the church, and I will tell y'all in a few minutes what's happening up here with this construction going on. We've got a lot of things happening on the street right now. But you do get a beautiful view of the bell tower of the church as we cross here over to my left. And the rectory house is the house that's undergoing some changes here. It's 1770. It's also one of the Cutno brothers' home. These double porches or piazzas on this house. So double piazzas, and it still has the original 9/9 wavy glass windows. To my right, this is one of our older homes in town too, 1740. This one's interesting because it has a roof line called a jerkin head roof line, which is really different for Georgetown of houses of this period. This is more of a New England or more of a British design. But I bring it up because the very next little cottage here is coming up on the right, has the same roof line. Well, it was built to look like the main house. This was the original carriage house. It's one of our only remaining carriage houses in town. So when you had a property like this, you would have the main house, the kitchen house, the carriage house, the smokehouse, the hot house, the well, the privy, whatever any animals lived in, whatever any other people lived in. So there were a lot of parts and pieces. Now I'm going to pull out here, and I'll pull over right here, and we are going to talk about this structure here on my left. The Hinckley House. The graveyard has the church attached to it. So the temple was a few blocks back. This is the second oldest Jewish cemetery in the state, and many of those headstones are on the angle because they're facing towards Jerusalem. So I'm leaving Duke Street, and now we're turning here onto Broad Street. Directly in front of me is Highway 17, or originally Church Street. And when the city was laid out, all the churches were meant to be at the end of each of these blocks. This area directly in front of us became Willow Bank Plantation, which was an indigo, then rice plantation. It also was the town common. So let's discuss our churches. A few of them. This is Bethel AME, African Methodist Episcopalian. After the Civil War, the once enslaved people, they were now able to build their own homes, own their own homes, be educated, and also have their own churches. So one of the first things they did was start building these churches. This originally was wooden. It later was bricked over, and the church itself had their first service around 1882. Now this was a church that really stressed education. The leaders of the African American community, they were attending service here. One family that stressed this was the Robinson family. They are buried in Georgetown at Mansfield Plantation, and the Robinson family had their great-great-great-granddaughter attend service here a few years ago. Her name is Michelle Robinson Obama, and her family is originally from the Georgetown area. So we thought during this time 5,000 to 8,000 enslaved people in Georgetown, but the numbers have gone up. It looks like we're looking at 10,000 to 18,000 now that we're documenting things more clearly. But you'll notice this church is a little bit different. Here behind us is the entrance to the church. In the 1950s, they did a renovation. They switched the entrance to the church to the back and changed all the pews and everything inside. They did this because one of the fathers at the time was an avid gardener. He wanted you to enter the church through the gardens first. Now across to my left, now this church should be open today 12 to 3, so I encourage you to come back up and go through there. This is Prince George Parish Church, the old Anglican Church, one of the oldest Anglican churches structures still standing on the East Coast. This church is celebrating 300 years as a parish this year. So all of the material to build it came originally from England. It was all across the Atlantic, and when they got to Georgetown with all the brick and everything, they dug a canal from the Samson River 3 blocks down all the way to the site of this church to barge all the material up here. Local school, and he would choose children to be in the film. Well, the film was lost. It was finally found in Germany. It was brought to Georgetown, and it was finally shown. And those kids, when it was shown, they were now our senior adults here in town. And they finally got to walk the red carpet and see themselves at the Pied Piper below. I mentioned earlier we had the Patriot filmed here. We've also had parts of the Notebook filmed here. So as I come down the street here, we're going to come up on my left to a khaki-colored house with green shutters. Well, this house was plaqued as a National Registry Historic Site for who lived here. His name was Josephine Rainey. Josephine Rainey had been born a slave. He was able to purchase his freedom and his family's freedom, and he became a businessman here in Georgetown. He bought this house and he lived here. Now the reason this was plaqued by Parks and Recreation as a National Registry Site is because Josephine Rainey was the first African American member to the U.S. House of Representatives. He was born in Georgetown and he died in Georgetown. So as we continue down the street, I'm going to mention that there's a lot of things that we're finding out about our city. We're finding things like travel journals. People wrote these detailed descriptions of what the city was like when they were here in the 18th and 19th century. And we're also finding out other things that are associated with some properties. One thing is associated with this, down to my right, there's a blue house on the left that's been plaqued with a national site also. That was the home of James Foley. James Foley, he was saved from slavery at 6 years old. He was taken to Maryland. He was educated. He then came back to Georgetown as a teacher and lived in that house. Well, James Foley, the person that saved him was his father's sister, and her name was Harriet Tubman. So that's why downtown, you may have noticed we have the Harriet Tubman sculpture. There's a man in Texas that had the original done for private collection, and then he had a second one done to travel the U.S. to teach about Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman saved around 750 slaves down in Charleston from 3 plantations and led them to freedom. She also, I don't know if y'all know this, she was inducted after her death into the CIA because she knew these rivers and these back area, these woods and all so well. So here to my right, I mentioned I sit on the board of architectural review. Well, this house has just been put back together. It was really just about 2 walls standing, and they beautifully restored this house and got all the details back. What we try to do is watch over what we see from the outside. We do not do interiors, we do not do color. But during the process, you see that house was discovered that it's actually 1780. So when I turn here on the Wood Street, the left side of me will be the old city, and everything in the 5 blocks over, see the architectural review. This structure here to my right is actually getting ready to undergo restoration. But it's not in the architectural review. So y'all, can we share a little bit of Georgetown Scandal? There have been 2 books written about the scandalous event in Georgetown, what Georgetown became known for up until the 1960s. In this house here to my left, my friend Ralph Ford lived here, and he was friends with a lot of these plantation owners in the middle of the 20th century. One person was Tom Yawkey. Tom Yawkey owned the Boston Red Sox. He came here to Georgetown, bought South Island Plantation, and he would bring down the Boston Red Sox players to train in Georgetown, and he would also bring a lot of his business associates. Well, to keep them entertained, Mr. Yawkey also encouraged his friend, Miss Hazel Weiss, to bring her business here. So up until about 1969, Georgetown was known for the famous Sunset Lodge. And all I'll say is Miss Hazel had the oldest profession. So there are 2 books about it, Keeper of the House and Sunset Lodge. Now, directly across the river in front of me, on the other side of the sandpit, was the Atlantic Coast Lumber Company, that large lumber mill. Well, sadly, it burned, and then the Great Depression kicked in. Georgetown land prices here were about $2.85 an acre. Oceanfront property, absolutely worthless. But this was a time when you had to come through Georgetown to go to Miami or New York. There was no I-95, only Highway 17. So a lot of people like the Vanderbilts, the Huntingtons, the Yankees, they started finding this city and finding these old rice plantations. And they started purchasing them for hunting lodges and for winter residences. Now, luckily, in my opinion, they did, because now a lot of that property, thousands upon thousands of acres, are now in conservation easements. They are in trust, or they have been gifted to the people of South Carolina. Here to my right is our only brick federal style home in town, 1760 on the house. This is the Robert Stewart home. The front door once again faces the river. So on the other side of this house down at the river is a wonderful restaurant. You get beautiful views down the waterway. It's an open air restaurant, so it could be a nice day to go down there. But in this house, this is where George Washington was entertained when he was here in 1791. The ladies of Georgetown gave a dinner for him here. He asked them at that time how many people lived here. Roughly 500 to 600 people in the city. We're now about 10,000. We're expected to grow 3 times over in just the next few years. Now, up the walkway here, this is the Kaminsky House Museum. They do tours 11, 1, and 3. We are celebrating 50 years as a house museum this year. Julia Piatt Kaminsky left this home in memory of her husband Harold Kaminsky and his mother Rose. Rose was of the Baum family of New York, and Rose was here at the turn of the century, and she was the first person instrumental in saving a lot of these old structures. But Julia and Harold married in the 1930s. She was younger, Episcopalian, and an old Georgetown family when she married Harold, who was a little bit older, Jewish and first generation. Well, they had a wonderful life together. They traveled the world. She left this house furnished as they lived in it, so a beautiful collection of American and English antiques all throughout. Now, the main reason she also left this house in memory of her husband Harold is because Harold was the person that sounded the alarms that Pearl Harbor was being attacked. He saw the planes first, and he's immortalized by an actor in the old film Tora, Tora, Tora. The house itself is strictly a museum house. The grounds are used for weddings and other events. Our downtown. Prior to 1988, there was not a lot down here. It was kind of not very many shops or restaurants at all. But We did this in 1988, put in the planted the oak trees you see, the copies of light fixtures from the turn of the century. We put in the harbor walkway. And then we had a visitor, 1989, Hurricane Hugo. He put about a 10-foot tidal surge into these buildings. The eye of the storm came in at McClellanville, just south of us. During COVID, we had a lot of new things open, so a lot of new shops and restaurants came into play in downtown Georgetown. So make sure to go all around and see everything. There's lots of new things. I'm going to pull up here to the other side. We're back to where we started from. If y'all will just, when you exit, there's a little step up here onto the sidewalk. Just be careful of that. And share any of your pictures or anything you have with us on our social media with Swamp Fox Tours. And we appreciate you coming. Y'all have a great day. If you have any questions about lunch or anything, let me know. Thank y'all.
Good tour.